did see Coleman on Bill Maher last night, touting his new book. Have you read the book, The End of Race Politics?
I have. Yes.
Yeah. So what do you think?
Good book. It's interesting though. And I say this, I would say it if Coleman were sitting next to me. I wish he wrote more about the cops, oddly enough. I wish that he wrote more about the role that plays in the kind of exaggeration that he so rightly decries about racism. No, the book is great. It's like, if it were classical music, it would be Sibelius. It's just so clean and perfect and reasoned. And he must get so frustrated that kind of reason just cuts no ice for so many people. But I thought he did a really nice job.
Well, you and I are going to be out of work if they end race politics. We're the black guys, remember? we are at least, I don't know what percentage, 40%, 60% of the play here is about how we analyze this complex set of issues and the kind of unique insights that we bring to bear and what we represent about race commentary. You know, we're not the people with three names. We're not Nicole Hannah-Jones or Ibram X. Kendi or Ta-Nehisi Coates or whomever, Michael Eric Dyson. We're kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum of that. And that's a spectrum that exists only because of the racial issue. So the end of race politics is the end of our gig, man. You okay with that?
Yes, because I make sure to have other things prepared. And to be honest, if I could only talk about linguistics and music, I would be perfectly happy. And more to the point, people are not going to stop talking about race and racism, and they're not going to stop exaggerating. I think if we're going to think of it that way, we're going to keep having stuff to talk about. But even if we didn't, that's technically what I'm going for. The only reason I got into this is because I started feeling in the late 90s, why do we have to exaggerate so much? It's not that there's no racism, but why is it that I'm expected as an enlightened person to so vastly exaggerate? And people are going to keep exaggerating. So here we are.
Well, about Coleman, I'm optimistic for his future, and I'm admiring of what he's accomplished. And he is a very talented young man. And I blurbed the book.
Do I detect some kind of hesitation, Glenn?
Well, there's going to be a comment. And the comment has to do with the end of, and I guess, is it Fukuyama, The End of History and the Last Man, that famous essay from way back interpreting what the international political implications of the defeat of the Soviet Union in the Cold War were and so on. The end. I mean, is race something that we need to get away from color blindness and all of that? This evocation of Martin Luther King Jr., 1963. So there's some arguments about color blindness. To have King reduced to that, you don't have to be Michael Eric Dyson to see the problem with that. I mean, or Cornel West to see the problem with that. The prophetic voice of King, color blindness, to have it come out as a procedural dictate that, we're not supposed to do affirmative action. We're not supposed to have racial preferences. So I think it kind of projects down onto a very small space, the weight of the racial history of the country. And it doesn't reckon with it in its fullness. And I'm not sure exactly how to flesh that out, but I can try. But that's one thing I think.
Well, Glenn, how about, I know what you mean. I know where you're coming from. Although I was very moved by one page he had where he gave all of these very ordinary statements that, frankly, the three name people make these days, and saying that on race, whatever you think about King, on diplomacy, Vietnam, whatever you think about King on poverty, Chicago, etc., he would not have agreed on race with an awful lot of things that have passed for wisdom since the 70s. And I think he was right. But yeah, Coleman didn't go on for 350 pages. And there is a limit to how much he's interested in plumbing the psychology of people, which is, that's just his personal preference. But can't you take what he's saying as pointing to the future Like maybe he thinks we shouldn't have been thinking about color in 1970, although I'm not sure he would say that. But it's the way we should be going, right? We can't change it tonight.
Yeah, well, I've argued that myself on more than one occasion, transracial humanism and all of that, and the critique of the heavy racial focus as we educate these kids at the elite campuses, where I want the kids to see themselves as privileged inhabitants of the 21st century at the pinnacle of Western civilization with a bequest of greatness from posterity, which they have now the opportunity to acquaint themselves with. And I don't want them to live in these little silos. I want them to be broader than that. And I agree with that. I agree with all of that. And I've been a strong critic of affirmative action as well. I once wrote a piece for the New York Times back in the early aughts when the Michigan cases were coming to fruition. And a lot of people were talking about affirmative action. And I was against color blindness as a normative principle in the piece. And I said it's a procedural restraint. It says, don't make the way you treat somebody conditional on their identity. But it's not a substantive moral position around the racial question, which would be more like, I'm indifferent to the racial composition of the prisons. I don't care about the differences in the poverty rates or the infant mortality rates or the mortality from COVID rates or whatever. I mean, race doesn't matter, not just at the level of a person being not defined by race, but at the level of a society being neutral or indifferent to the racial aspect of its own social ecology. Who lives in the ghettos, who's in prison, I've said, et cetera. And I said, whereas the procedural restraint, blindness, don't judge the kid's application for a program of study by this superficial trait, was very compelling to me and to a lot of people. The substantive blindness, let history's long shadow of racial hierarchy continue on without it without being moved by it. That I thought was less compelling morally, much less compelling. And I thought, moreover, that the people who try to bait and switch me, that is, get me to agree to the latter proposition, we should stop worrying about how many Black people are in prison because they're Black, by the former argument, it's a bait and switch. King wanted to be colorblind. A person's race doesn't matter. A person's race doesn't matter for whether or not I marry him or her. A person's race doesn't matter for whether or not we admit them to this program. And therefore, I should be indifferent to the racial aspect of America's social hierarchy. That I feel that's a problematic move. And I give one example to see what I'm talking. So I have a city. The city is electing representatives to the city council. And they could do it in one of two ways. They can do it in at-large elections across the city, or it can break up the city into residential districts and do it at the district level. Everybody running at large means that the minority candidates are less likely to have a chance of getting elected. You break up the city into residential districts, every neighborhood having its own ethnic and racial coloration, likely to have some voice in the government of the country. Now, whether or not to do that is a question in a way, about blindness. Should I be indifferent to the racial consequence of the electoral system or not? And that kind of question, given our history, strikes me as you can't resolve it by citing King's speech in 1963 or Justice Thomas's opinion in the Harvard Students for Fair Admission civil rights case. That's a question about historical judgment and historical responsibility that I think transcends the conventional colorblindness debate. I've talked for a long time. Am I making any sense to you?
You are, and you're making me think about how maybe Coleman could have done another 50 pages, and it puts him in hotter water, but because Coleman's response to a lot of that, not all of it, not the voting part, but a lot of it is that the differences that are there are because of cultural differences. And you can put it that way, but what you really mean is something Black people need to work on. And so you might argue that the overrepresentation of Black people in prison is because of problems with us ourselves. I think Coleman would agree with that. I'm not saying that myself, but I think Coleman would agree with that. Or, the number of Black students who are eligible for this, elite program or that one, it's because of aspects of the Black family or something like that. It's that we're not doing something that Jewish and Korean kids are doing. And so his answer to a lot of this, and he does talk in the book about how there are differences that clearly are not due to racism. And what he doesn't quite say is that the differences are cultural. There's something about Black culture that means that we are apparently more represented in basketball. There is something apparently about Cambodian culture that means that more of them at donut shops in California, although I'm sure that that's just a matter of chance. But there's some things where cultures value some things more than others, or Jewish shopkeepers in Harlem in the early 20th century. And so his answer is that, as opposed to that we should look at it as Glenn Loury was looking at, for example, prisons in 1999, where you think, well, something's wrong if this many people who are of color are in prison. And I fully understand what your analysis of it was. But for Coleman, color blindness also makes sense, I think, because most of the discrepancies are based on things that we need to think about and get better at. Now, that's fighting words for a great many people. And maybe he didn't want to go there with this book. But is that a fair representation of what you get from his views?
Yeah, I don't think you distort it. And I have a lot of sympathy for those views. Nobody is coming to save us from the enemy within.
You don't like Omar.
Omar is a part of a manifestation of the enemy within, the rot within African-American culture and society, which inhibits us from being able to seize opportunity. We need to take responsibility for our lives, for our communities. We need to own up to our what we owe our ancestors and what we owe our progeny, the Black families, 7 in 10 kids born to a woman without a husband, the glorification of violence, the nihilism, and we've lost our way. But I would say Black culture, which is real, is not autonomous from the larger matrix of cultural, political, social, and economic development. A drug market, there are buyers and sellers. The fact that the existence of illicit commerce and substances might lead to a certain kind of criminal organizations getting formed, and the certain patterns of behavior that are counterproductive being observed in some quarter of society. But the larger culture is clearly implicated in the phenomenon of hedonistic pursuit of whatever. People are turning on their television, they're looking at, some of the kids who are buying are driving in from the suburbs. And so if I just make that into a Black space, it's like I'm carving out the African-American component of society as if it were autonomous. And then I lecture them about being like that, when in fact, they're a part of the larger system. Even in the marriage and dating market, man. So interrelations between Black men and women have some problematic aspects, which I think are manifested by family structure statistics of the sort that I was just citing, kids born out of wedlock and abortion rates and so forth and so on. This is the fruit of relationships that are developing such as they are developing, and they're relationships among Black men and women. But how Black men and women relate to each other can't be completely independent of how white men and Black women relate to each other, because there's a question of the bargaining that goes on inside relationships and the outside options of the people in those relationships, which depend upon the behavior, not just of Black people, but also of others. I don't know, maybe that example is kind of arcane, but I'm just saying to then look at how Black men and women relate and wag my finger at them. Look at how you are, and not realize that they would be relating very differently if Black men, women, and white men were relating differently. The intra-racial gender dynamic not being independent of the interracial gender dynamic makes it more difficult to just talk about as if it were an independent thing, Black culture. So
it's so hard though, because they're also just vagaries. Like Black teen pregnancy, way, way, way down. If we're going to talk about babies having babies, we're going to sound a little 1991 at this point. Nobody knows exactly why. What you just described about the problems between Black men and Black women, I'm familiar with that literature. Is that true now? Or are we talking about problems that were true maybe 20 years ago and before that are less now, including the woman with however many kids by however many men? That's not, things change. And it wasn't because of any one thing. These things change. And as we both know, the Black family was much stronger when racism was absolutely overt, segregation was overt, and circumstances were much different. And so social history is so complicated that sometimes I think it can be hard to say we need to address the racial imbalance because we're not really always as sure as we'd like to be as to why it's there. I'm trying to stick up for Coleman here, although I completely understand what you're saying. This stuff is hard.